Today is the 25th of April, and in Australia and New Zealand, it's ANZAC Day. And ANZAC stands for the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and it's a national day of remembrance in both our countries that commemorates the fallen and the injured and the families of the fallen who have suffered over our history in war, civil conflicts, and as volunteers abroad. Tonight I would like to explain my personal involvement with the impact of the First World War, as strange as that may sound, seeing the war finished 100 years ago. It's been an interesting journey for me personally, and as is often said, the more you learn, the less you understand. I would also like to touch briefly on the unique and enduring relationship between the USA and Australia that commenced on the 4th of July 1918 and continues, as the General said, unbroken until this day. Australia is the only country that has fought alongside the USA in every major global conflict for the last 100 years. No other country can make claim to that. And so ANZAC Day today has become the most sacred day on the Australian and New Zealand calendar, and it comes to represent the day when we recognise victims of all wars, not just World War I. But in all wars, of course, there is a cost. Growing up as a child in suburban Melbourne, I had three great aunts, Rita, Peggy and Elsie. They don't have names like that these days. And they all had one thing in common. Well, they had a couple of things in common. They lived in a small country town of Echuca, which is on the border between the states of New South Wales and Victoria, about 4 hours north of Melbourne. The other thing they had in common is they never married. My wife, who was a New Zealander, as I said, had a great auntie in New Zealand in the same circumstance. She never married. In fact, lots of women in that era never married. Their potential husbands lay buried in the sands of Gallipoli, or more commonly in the muddy fields of France. In Britain, the situation was even worse. In a recently published book called Singled Out, author Virginia Nicholson writes how nearly 2 million women survived without men after the First World War. The loss of so many young men, particularly from our country towns, had an impact that was felt and is still felt through the generations in Australia. Tonight I'd like to just touch on three of these battles: Pozieres, Villiers-Bretonneux and Le Hamel. Pozieres was a bloodbath. In all, over 23,000 Australian casualties took, and for what? Pozieres is a small village in the Somme Valley of northern France that had already been blown apart by thousands of German shells over the previous 2 months. By the time the Battle of Pozieres was over, there were 23,000 Australian casualties and 6,800 dead or died from their wounds, and all of this in 2 weeks. And many of those dead have no known grave. These horrific numbers are comparable to the whole 8 months in Gallipoli. It is no wonder that Pozieres operations are viewed as the bloodiest days in Australian history. Today, the Pozieres War Memorial has an adjacent windmill that commemorates the battle. A few years ago, I was lucky enough to be studying in France, and I went and laid a wreath at Pozieres of Australian wattle and eucalypt. And it seemed to me no coincidence that the local florist in Pozieres sells Australian flowers, because I'm pretty sure they get a constant stream of Australians coming and doing what I did to buy a wreath. The second great battle I'd like to touch on, some 20 months later, was to take place in a small village called Villiers-Bretonneux, on the road to the strategically important French railhead of Amiens. The accepted logic at the time was that if Amiens was to fall, so would Paris. The second Battle of Villiers-Bretonneux, as it became known, took place from the 24th to the 25th of April 1918, 100 years ago exactly today. 2 Australian brigades took place in the battle to counter the German Spring Offensive, and Australians suffered 2,400 casualties, but they took what was to be known as the first night action or the night attack of World War I. Put it into context, 2,400 Australian casualties, but there were 9,500 British and 3,500 French casualties in the same battle. The French military leader, General Foch, spoke of the Australians' astonishing valiance, and the British General Sir Henry Rawlinson talked of Australians' determination, tenacity and valour. The French to this day have never forgotten the Australian sacrifice at Villiers-Bretonneux. The Australian flag still flies over the same village 100 years later, and kangaroos feature over the entrance to the town hall, and the main street is called Rue de Melbourne. The third battle I'd like to talk about, which may have some relevance tonight, is Le Hamel. The earth shook and the mind boggled at the concussion, and so started the Battle of Le Hamel. 100 years ago this July, the battle started on the 4th of July in what soldiers call an all-in-arms battle, in that it involved the infantry attacking with tank support and with supplies being delivered by air, which was most unusual, and by advancing artillery support, a new innovation in warfare. The battle was planned meticulously by Australian Commander Sir John Monash and represented a major advancement in military tactics, a far cry from similar attacks in that region 2 years before. Importantly, the battle also represented the first time Australian and American troops were to fight together. In deference to this, Monash held the attack back until the 4th of July, American Independence Day. Monash became the first non-American to command US troops. It was also the American troops' first offensive action of World War I. 4 American companies were under Monash's command, which proved to be, ultimately, a turning point in the Battle of the Somme. As Monash said, from the first time when our soldiers came in contact with the American doughboys and they mixed with them, they took kindly to each other. He found the Americans to be, quote, very fine chaps, ready and eager to learn and not above taking advice. The officer commanding the US troops at the time, General Pershing, was stunned to find that there were 2,000 Americans attached to the Australian Fourth Army, which he thought was just for training purposes, but they were about to join into a set-piece Australian attack. Pershing ordered these troops to be withdrawn. Stories were then rife about Americans peeling off their uniforms and putting on Australian jackets so they wouldn't have to leave their new mates. The Americans and the Australians got on that well. This story is probably not exactly true. The truth is that there were 2 documented examples of American troops putting on Australian uniforms and trying to hide amongst Australian troops. But the message had got through to Pershing that the Americans were not prepared willingly to leave their new mates, their new Aussie mates. And as a result, he agreed that some Americans, I think it was 3 companies, could be embedded with the Australian troops. So not fighting as separate platoons, but embedded into the Australian troops under the command of Monash. Monash said it would take 89 minutes to take Hamel. It took 93 minutes. Monash's planning was meticulous. The British, as a result of the battle, decorated 14 Americans. What many people in the United States perhaps don't know, and neither do Australians know, that Australia came under significant attack during the First World War on our mainland. The fact that we didn't know this is not because of a cover-up. The fact is we were never taught this. We were never talked about at school, we just simply didn't know. But what happened is quite interesting, in Darwin in particular. And Darwin is our northern capital of the Northern Territory, and what happened there in 1942 is referred to as Australia's Pearl Harbor. So on the 19th of February 1942, the largest single attack on Australian soil took place. On that day, 242 Japanese aircraft in 2 separate raids attacked Darwin and our 2 airfields. This was to be the first of 100 air raids against Australia in 1942 and 43, and as I said, most Australians don't know that. Attacks also took place in our northern cities of Broome and the Queensland towns of Townsville and Mosman and Horn Island. The Japanese attacking force in Darwin came from the same carrier group that had attacked Pearl Harbor 3 months previously at the start of the Pacific War. If I look at the apparent futility of World War I, particularly at the Battle of Gallipoli, and I ask what the point of it all was, I remember something that General Hooley said to me over breakfast here a few weeks ago at the Marines Club. that our experiences, even our bad experiences, means that we have learnt lessons that can benefit us in the longer term. Without Gallipoli, would have Australians been as effective in the Western Front? And would have Australians been able to fight so ferociously to defend our country from a real threat of invasion from the Japanese in the dark days of World War II? In this context, to a large degree, Churchill, who was at least partially responsible for Gallipoli, it would be a fair question to ask, would have he become such a superb leader in World War II without the searing defeat of Gallipoli? But the slaughter of World War I, the loneliness of my great aunties, the decimated country towns, and the devastated families of the fallen, was it worth it? To me, there has to be one answer, and the answer is yes. In the famous poem, Flanders Fields, it states, "You are the living, take up the quarrel with the foe. To you from falling hands we throw the torch, and it's yours to hold high. If ye break the faith with us who die, we shall not sleep." Australians will not break the faith, lest we forget.